The top 10 most segregated cities in the United States. That is the topic of today's video. We're going to understand what segregation is and what cities in the United States are the most divided. Segregation simply means that different people are kept in different places and that there's a clear divide between one community and the next. That does not imply that diversity in communities themselves that are demographically isolated are some way or another segregated. There's a real difference between diversity, communities, and segregation. Take, for example, South Brooklyn. New York City is known for its diversity. The areas that are green are going to be black or African American. The blues are going to be white. The orange means Hispanic or Latino. And the red would imply Asian. You can clearly see that block by block, there are different communities in South Brooklyn. However, does that imply that they are segregated? No, because they still congregate around the same community. Take this part of Atlanta, Georgia. You can see there's African American, Hispanics, and Asians all mixed in together, but you can see an outline around the outside of white population. That would suggest that this predominantly white part of Georgia, the communities came together to form a diverse and inclusive economical or industrial hub. However, while this part of Atlanta is very diverse, when you zoom out and look at the whole metropolitan area, you can see that the southern area of the metropolitan area is predominantly black, and that the white part of the metropolitan area is the northern part, and that there exists a clear defined line of segregation, and it's that line of segregation or that division that we're going to focus on today's video. And it's those clear and defined lines of segregation that mark the difference between diversity and segregation. Take the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, where an outer loop highway clearly marks the boundaries of the black communities. Sure, there's some type of diversity within that area, but it's a clear and defined line of segregation. And we have to really understand the difference between diversity and segregation, since many people who are racist and believe in segregation are quick to point out that diversity is exactly the same thing when it's clearly not. Take the San Francisco area where you have Asian, Hispanic, white, and black populations. Is this metropolitan area segregated? Or do they have communities? And that's a very important question for us to understand, because a lot of large cities are segregated while other large cities have communities. And we really have to understand that to really grasp the context of today's video. Take the Los Angeles metropolitan area that is predominantly Hispanic. There's pockets of black, Asian, and white. Is it segregated, or are they just different communities? On today's list, we're going to see a clear line of segregation. Doesn't exist in Los Angeles. But number one, Birmingham, Alabama, has a clear and defined line of segregation. On one side, a predominantly white wealthy area. A mountain divides Homewood from Birmingham. On one side of the mountain, Shelby County is the richest county in Alabama. On the other side of the mountain is one of the most impoverished and dangerous cities in the United States. This line of segregation marks a difference on how the rich and the poor live. On one side, you have one of the highest murder rates. You are 4 times more likely to be murdered in Birmingham than you are in the city of Chicago. And the white population that lives in Birmingham makes 4 times more money than the black population. However, that is despite the fact that blacks are predominantly the majority here, which means that even though in Birmingham blacks are the majority, whites are taking home most of the money. Number 2 is Detroit, Michigan. The city limits of Detroit can be easily spotted on a race map. And not only is the city limits noticeable because of its demographics, but also because of the investment. On one block, you have restaurants and pubs open, and then you cross the street and you enter Detroit city limits. The moment that you enter Detroit city limits, you can see the difference from one block to the next. On one block, everything's open, restaurants are full, and it feels safe and secure. You cross one block over into Detroit, and you enter one of the scariest urban landscapes on the entire planet. Many African Americans fled southern cities and went to northern cities hoping to get away from discrimination in the Deep South. However, the sentiment in northern cities really hasn't been any different than in the Deep South. And today, the city of Detroit remains one of the worst places in the United States to live. Number 3, Youngstown, Ohio. Just like Detroit, the city limits are clearly defined by poverty and the black population, and the people that live in this region must be clearly aware not to move into certain neighborhoods where literally one single street divides the black from the white communities. So how has this segregation worked for Youngstown, Ohio? Well, today, it's one of the most empty and depressing cities in the United States. And while many of the white people have to come into town to work, they leave behind a city that's empty, lacking investment. Segregation really creates a bad economical environment, and it hurts people on both sides of that division. Yet, despite the fact its harmful effects, this is the route that many American cities have chosen to hurt themselves to ensure that they're kept separate from other sectors of the economy. Number 4 is one of the worst examples of this, where the African American communities are lacking roads being paved, utilities, and have some of the highest crime stats possible, while on the other side of the division, the cities there are named some of the safest and best in the country. Clearly, in Jackson, Mississippi, the African Americans are deprived of any opportunity, and every resource possible is granted to the cities and municipalities that are predominantly white. It's one of the biggest contrasts that you're going to see in the United States. A city that is falling apart and struggling on one side and thriving on the other. This is the harmful effects of segregation, and Jackson, Mississippi remains one of the most embarrassing cities in the United States, withholding investment from the African American community, which is the predominant population, and giving all the resources to the white communities. Clearly, those white communities thriving simply by depriving other communities from having basic utilities. Number 5 is the city of Chicago. Now, while other large cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco are not segregated, it is incredible to see just a large city where millions of people have to live along the lines of segregation. And this will come to a huge surprise to the people of Chicago, who see themselves as a diverse city. But just because you have diversity doesn't mean that you have communities that are integrated. And there's a difference between having diversity and having segregation. And unfortunately for Chicago, they have diversity, but it's segregated. And this is a sentiment that's felt throughout the Midwest, with adjacent cities like Milwaukee having the same exact problem. And in the state of Wisconsin nearby, African Americans make 50% less than whites. It really is a bad, hateful region where African Americans and other races are deprived economically. Number 6 is Austin, Texas. Here, the whites and the Hispanics are separated roughly by Interstate 35. Austin's a city that's growing and thriving for some, but becoming a death trap for others. And while it's not the stereotypical white and black situation that you find through most of the United States, whether it's natives versus transplants or rich versus poor, this highway divides two different worlds. On one side, poverty and crime, and on the other side, beautiful landscaped areas and growing communities. This divide makes Austin, Texas one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and you'll even find billboards and propaganda among people's homes letting you know how they feel about this divide. Even when you're on Highway 35, you'll notice that on one side of the road there's skyscrapers, and on the other side of the road there aren't. The wealthy transplants versus pretty much everybody else. Homelessness is visible throughout the entire area. Number 7 is Memphis, Tennessee. You can see here clear lines where specific roads mark where the whites and the blacks live. Unlike anywhere else in the United States, literally all you have is an invisible line that separates races. And the same repetitive pattern of cities like Birmingham, Jackson, and Detroit, this is predominantly an African American city. However, economically, African Americans don't have the greatest attainments. And the African American community is subjected to situations that the white community would never allow to happen to themselves. And it's this segregation that's held back the entire city. See, the thing about segregation is it doesn't just hold back the community you're oppressing, it holds back the entire city, the entire metropolitan area, and the entire region. This economical fragmentation hurts everybody, and holding down entire sections of your metropolitan area only means that the city and metro area that you live in has a lot of problems. Number 8 is Mobile, Alabama. A line marks the difference between the black city of Mobile and Baldwin County, the white side of the metropolitan area. On one side of the metropolitan area, you have the lowest life expectancy of anywhere in the United States, higher murder rates, high crime rates, an entire segment of the population living in some of the most poverty-stricken regions of the country. And then, on the other side of the metropolitan area, you think you're in a Florida beach town. And this is the way the people in Alabama like their segregation. They'll even go as far as littering to let you know that you've crossed the segregation line. And as you're driving through Mobile, Alabama, as you cross between white and black areas, you'll notice a line of debris or litter on the road marking the segregation line where one neighborhood starts and the other one ends. It's a really sad and depressing backwards mentality that they have in Alabama. Number 9 is Louisville, Kentucky. Highway 65 and 264 divide southwest Louisville and west Louisville from the east end. One side is poverty, African Americans, and other minorities, and on the other side, exclusively the white population. The Louisville city is so divided that even the school systems has to bus kids around from one side of town to the other so that the schools are not purely segregated, since on one end of the metropolitan area, it can be close to 100% black, and on the other end, 100% white. And while a lot of progress has been made into turning Louisville into a more diverse city, like welcoming people from other countries like Cuba and Somalia and Vietnam, nonetheless, there's still a black and white divide. And on the white side of town, things are looking great. There's growth and opportunity. But when you enter the west end of town, you can see an area that's been economically deprived. Some progress, but some things have not changed. Number 10, Atlanta, Georgia. The southern part of the city is black. The northern part of the city is white. Most of the diversity is on the white side of town. Nonetheless, despite the fact that Atlanta has all this diversity and it does have a lot of black wealth, it still remains at a place where the south meets the Appalachians. In northeast of Atlanta, it's predominantly white, safe, and clean, but southwest of Atlanta, it's part of the Deep South. Despite being one metropolitan area, these two very different regional areas meet, the Deep South and the Appalachians, and there's a huge difference on how people live on one side of Atlanta and how they live on the other, the northern part being predominantly white and the southern part being more African American. And despite me always admiring the culture surrounding the city of Atlanta, I've never really felt safe or comfortable in many of the city's African American neighborhoods. A lot of people are cool, but other people are still with the backwards mentality. And that is our list of the top 10 most segregated cities in the United States. Charlotte, North Carolina narrowly escaped our list because North Carolina as a whole has a lot of diversity, but this city has ingrained in it a lot of very negative racial context. And you can see that there's a lot of light blue colors, which means that there's a transition between white and other races, not just a stark contrast, especially as you head off into the suburbs. But you can see that within the city core, the white community is actually more segregated than some of the suburban parts. Quite an interesting thing there. Many times people are brought into cities thinking that they're going to have a more united community, but in reality, in the case of Charlotte, the suburbs are actually more integrated than the actual city. You're probably wondering why Montgomery, Alabama isn't on this list, despite the fact it is the most racist city in the United States by far. It doesn't really have this geographical segregation. The city of Montgomery is predominantly African American, and the white parts of the city are transiently shifting into white populations, not these sudden racial boundaries. You have to look at the region as a whole to understand why Montgomery is like that. I want to let you guys know that the tool we're using for today's video is bestneighborhood.org. That's where we're looking at these race maps. And so far, they update these maps constantly, which means that they are a very reliable source of information. And while I don't have any commercial affiliation with them, it is a tool that we're using for today's video that I find to be very accurate. You can see that around the area of Montgomery, some pockets are almost 100% white, and some pockets are almost 100% black. There is yellow for Hispanic, but I will tell you that only the two smaller pockets of yellow are accurate. The two larger pockets of Hispanic on the left are some type of clerical error or inaccuracy. It's probably because these are military bases and the people residing there are probably changing periodically. And the issue with Montgomery right now is that Montgomery is being disputed. It means that there's a lot of battling for the city of Montgomery, and that's why you see these stark contrasting colors. And while in most places there's a clear defined line of black and white, you can kind of see it with the rivers just northeast of Montgomery, but it's really a confusing place when it comes to segregation and racism. So despite being a region with a lot of racial tension, you don't have these stark racial boundaries, and that's possibly why there's so much conflict and dispute in this city, because there's no real defined boundaries. It's kind of all mixed together. They're all on top of each other and they don't get along, so quite a mess. St. Louis, Missouri is another city that has a clear defined segregation line, and it is just as well economically divided. But in the city of St. Louis, the labor force isn't as segregated, as people do commute from one part to the other. So in the daytime, it's really hard to tell that this line exists. But when you see where people actually live, it is very starkly segregated. Alright guys, that is today's video. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe. And if you think there's a city that should have been on my list, go ahead and hit the comment section. I'll leave you guys with a beat that I'm working on that's supposed to be Haitian compa music, but I'm really struggling to get the right sound. De la compa de Haití a las calles de Miami. De la compa de Haití a las calles de Miami. Well, I'm not exactly Wyclef. This is just me playing around in FL Studio, so yeah, you don't have to have any criticism on that.